T.S. Eliot is an American English poet, playwright, literary critic, and editor. More importantly, he is a leader of the modernist movement in poetry in his monumental works such as The Wasteland and Four Quarters. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1948 for, quote, his outstanding pioneer contribution to present-day poetry, end quote. In this lecture, I will talk about T.S. Eliot's biography and his poem, The Wasteland. T.S. Eliot was born in St. Louis, Missouri. His father was a successful businessman, while his mother wrote poetry and was a social worker, which was a new profession in the early 20th century. His family allowed him the widest education available in his time, with no influence from his father to be practical and to go into business. From a young age, Eliot suffered from a congenital double inguinal hernia, which meant that he could not participate in many physical activities and was thus prevented from socializing with his peers. This made him turn to literature instead. Eliot went to Harvard, where he was influenced by professors renowned in poetry, philosophy, and literary criticism, such as George Santayana and Irving Babbitt. After graduation, Eliot moved to Paris, where he studied philosophy at Sorbonne. After this, he went back to Harvard and then to Oxford on a scholarship. He did not like Oxford at all and spent much of his time in London, which is where he met Ezra Pound, an influential American literary figure who was crucial to his beginning career as a poet. It soon became clear that he did not intend to go back to the States, but wished to remain in England, where all his friends were. It was his marriage to Vivian Highwood, a Cambridge governess, that made clear to his family of his intention to stay in Europe for life. His family was immensely unhappy with this decision. Unfortunately, the marriage itself was not happy for Eliot either. Vivian had many health issues including insomnia and migraine, as well as mental instability. Professionals have since argued that her symptoms suggest bipolar disorder or paranoid schizophrenia. She was often sent away for extended periods of time to improve her health, but this also detached the couple emotionally. In the picture on the right, we can see Eliot standing next to Virginia Woolf, another important modernist 20th century writer, looking quite happy, while his wife stands in a distance from the two of them, clearly lacking in confidence and feeling uncomfortable. After 18 years of marriage, the couple separated, and 5 years later, Vivian was committed to a mental hospital, where she was to stay until her death 9 years later. At the age of 68, Eliot remarried his secretary, who was 30 years old. He had no children from either of his wives. Eliot's first marriage had a great influence on his poetry, a point which he was reluctant to admit until later in his life. The lack of proper logical communication Eliot must have experienced with his wife is a recurring theme in The Wasteland as well, where there are many women characters who are on the verge of paranoia, demanding answers from their man but not getting any. The Wasteland is Eliot's most famous poem. It is comprised of 434 lines and is divided into 5 sections. It is widely regarded as one of the most important poems of the 20th century and a central work of modernist poetry that reflects the fragmented psychology of Europe in the aftermath of World War I. It contains numerous allusions to the Bible, Greek mythology, the legend of the Holy Grail, and the Fisher King, and many more, reflecting Eliot's attention to provide the European readers with a common intellectual and historical ground on which they can unify and rebuild Europe after the devastating war. The poem is written mainly in English, but includes lines in other languages such as Latin, Greek, Italian, German, and French. Now let us go into the poem analysis. Two important motifs that run through the entire poem are first, water, and second, expectation and disappointment. The first section of the poem that I've quoted here can be interpreted within the framework of these two motifs. Let's begin by looking at the first section's title, The Burial of the Dead. It is taken from the part of the Book of Common Prayers of the Church of England, which illustrates the proper method of memorial service. In the book, the writer talks about life resembling a shadow, and wishing that the body that is being buried will gain a new life and live forever. When used as the title of the first section of the poem, it sets the tone of expectation, particularly that of revival or resurrection. The Wasteland can then be said to be a poem containing many variations in which different expectations are met with disappointments. The first 4 lines of the poem, starting with "April is the cruelest month," talk about the expectation of new life. The spring rain, which coincides with the motif of water, is supposed to be the embodiment of new life and hope, but ironically it is not spring but winter which kept us warm with its forgetful snow. Spring rain has the opposite effect of melting the snow and uncovering the ground which was full of things that the poetic voice wanted to forget. Therefore, instead of new life, spring brings the poetic voice pain and disappointment. In the third stanza, the poetic voice listens to a girl speaking to him about hyacinths, a symbol of death and rebirth. "You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl." The reminiscing tone of her speech about the gift of flowers and the nickname she obtained as a result echoes her expectation for a continuance of their romance. Instead of replying, the poetic voice remains silent and writes about his inner thoughts in a first-person narrative. The word "yet" is used here as a conjunction to carry a sense of negation, hinting that the girl's expectation for romance would be unmet. The poetic voice thinks about how their interaction in the garden only stripped him of normal function of his senses. I could not speak, and my eyes failed, and that he was left in a state of limbo where he was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. The allusion to the story of Tristan and Isolde in Ode Lund Le Des Murs reiterates the sense of disappointment that underlies their conversation. Like the dying Tristan who waits for Isolde to save him but fails to be reunited with her, the poetic voice gave the girl hyacinths expecting romance, only to experience a moment of paralysis of the body and confusion of the mind.